Hello, welcome everybody to my latest infrared photography live stream. I'd like to say thank you to everybody who tuned in last time when we had some technical challenges. Hopefully we've got all those sorted out. I've got some new gear here. Everything should run much more smoothly. So what I want to do is work through all of the questions and images that people have sent in. If you are here live, then let me know in the comments. If you've sent something in, then I'll try to move it to the top of the queue. Otherwise, I'll work through all of the material that's been sent in the order that it was submitted. Now, there's a lot, so it might take me more than one stream to get this all in, but be patient. We'll get to it all. If not today, then in the very near future. Okay, so if everybody can hear me okay in the live stream, let me know how things are looking and sounding there. And I will go ahead and dive in. So the first question I have is from George. George says, ready to give IR a go. We'll be converting an Olympus OMD Mark III. What are your thoughts for a newbie in regarding full conversion or not? As I understand, I would need to purchase external filters for the conversion. So yes, if you do get a full conversion, you would need to use external filters. And so I cover this. This is a pretty complex topic, and I cover this pretty extensively in the book. So if you're interested in the book, check that out. I'll kind of hit the highlights here. So the challenge is that it's really a personal preference, and it depends upon what you want to shoot. So, for example, if you're strictly into monochrome infrared, then maybe a conversion to a specific filter would interest you. If you want to have color, then like sort of a normal amount of color, then maybe something like a 590 nanometer would work well for you. If you want all of a whole variety of options, then you probably need to go full spectrum so that you have that availability. If you want to shoot ultraviolet, if you want to shoot with an IR chrome filter, then you're going to need to go full spectrum. But the question, then comes around to, should that be your first conversion? It's really a personal preference. Depends on how much experience you have as a photographer and how much confidence you have in your own style. I personally love having a camera converted to 590 nanometers. It gives me the flexibility to just grab and go without having to worry about filters. But I also, love having the ability to do just about anything with a full spectrum camera. So it really depends on your preferences. There's no one right answer. Having all the filters can be, a bit of a nuisance at times to manage all of that stuff. And so that gets a bit tricky. But there's pros and cons to both ways. So there's really no one right answer. It just depends on, how seriously you think you're going to be into it, and how much of an investment you want to make. So that's a quick answer, a lot more detail in the book. And I could answer more specific questions as well. So let me just catch up on the chat here and see what's going on. Welcome everybody. Some new people, some familiar names. Let's see. Okay, great. Okay, so let's dive into the next question. The next question is from Harold, who is here in the chat. So that is, why is it so difficult to find ultra wide angle lenses that perform well for infrared? Not simply from a hotspot perspective, but from an image quality perspective. So there's a couple reasons for that. The first one is the image circle. So, your camera is a rectangle. It's maybe a 3x4 or some dimension of a rectangle typically. But the circle that needs to be produced to fill that space is going to be a perfect circle. And it has to be wide enough to cover that. Now, with certain long lenses, it's pretty easy to create that image circle, but with a wide angle lens, it becomes much more difficult to fill that space. And so it requires a much more complex optical design to get a good wide angle lens. So that's one of the issues. The next one really has to do with aberrations. So typically, like for example, chromatic aberrations. One of the things that a lot of visible light photographers, I say that pejoratively, they don't realize is that every wavelength of light actually focuses at a different plane. And optical designs are required to pull all of those wavelengths together into a single point of focus so that your camera can focus. I mean, if the reds focus differently than the blues, maybe that would make for an interesting 3D image, but it would make for a pretty terrible photograph. So that is another complexity that happens in lens design, whether you've got an achromatic or an APO type lens. It defines, that optical design defines how well those things are brought into focus. And then, of course, you'll notice that more in the corners of an image. So in the corners of an image, you're more likely to see things like chromatic aberration compared to the center of the image. Next is distortion, which is going to be more pronounced in a wide angle lens. And so a lot of cameras and software will try to correct that distortion, and then that correction is yet another change to the image that happens. And the last thing that I want to show you an image here and kind of talk about this from a visual perspective, because I think it'll help you to understand it. So let me find the image here that I want to share of what I'm kind of talking about for sensors, because I think there's another factor to this that doesn't yet exist in photography, but I think it's coming soon. And that has to do with the sensor itself. So let me switch over here to another image here, and this is like the kind of a typical image you would see when talking about depth of field, right? So you've got a camera here, and then you've got a subject, you've got the beginning of your depth, maybe your focus is here, your depth of field is here, and it stretches out to this far end. And this is the kind of image we're typically shown when we think about a depth of field. And for a normal or telephoto lens, this is pretty accurate, but the reality is different. The reality is actually more like this. It's more like we're kind of in a sphere, if you imagine all points being a 3D sphere coming in towards the camera. And so the challenge here is that the focal plane is not actually straight like our sensors in the camera. It's actually curved. And so this creates a problem, because if I focus here with my flat sensor, then the edges are going to be more likely to be out of focus. But if I focus here, then the center's going to be out of focus. So this is one of the things that I think is coming. It's probably not coming really soon, maybe 10 years or so, is that what we'll need to do to solve this is have curved sensors. You know how you're starting to see in the marketplace now, there's curved monitors. So you get a wide angle monitor that's curved so that the edges of the monitor are equal distant to your eyes as the center, so that you have a better focus. So a curved monitor works really well for when you're sitting and viewing. The same thing is going to apply to a sensor. If you have a curved sensor, then it can adapt to this curved focal plane without needing to worry about as much distortion. Now, of course, the challenge is going to be that the different focal lengths will result in different amounts of curvature. So it's not just a curve; it's going to have to be a sensor that can go from flat to curved. It's going to be a complex technology, but I think that will help address the challenge that we have with wide angle lenses. Next up, I want to work on an image that Harold sent in. So let me pull this up. Let me find it here, and I'll give you a preview. It's a really, really nice image, and what I want to do is take a crack at it and give it a little bit of an edit. So let's see here. Okay, so first up, I will show you an edit that I've already done, and then we'll go back to the beginning and start from scratch with this image. So let's see here. Let me switch over to this. Get used to playing with my new toys here. Okay, so this is the image as edited, and so a gorgeous image. Very nice, Harold. Excellent work. I love the scenery, the reflections, the use of the sky and the subject. Excellent, subject for infrared. So let's go back. This is sort of the final version. Let me reset and take a look at what it looked like in the beginning. So this is the version, as I saw it originally, and let's walk through the process that I used to edit it to get to that version that we just saw. Okay, so first thing that I want to do when I'm editing an infrared image is work on white balance. So I'm going to come up here to the profile section. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see up here on the right-hand side under profile, I've got a couple profiles. These are part of the infrared profile pack, which you can get from my blog. I've got profiles for hundreds of cameras. And what these do is these help us to get a good white balance. Before I jump into that, let me show you why. So if I take the white balance picker and I white balance on the clouds here, you'll see that it didn't do a very good job. It barely did anything. I got a bit of a tint adjustment, and the temperature bottomed out at 2000. Let's see here, at 2000 Kelvin. The problem is that infrared light actually has a color temperature of about 900 Kelvin, so below the end of the scale. So what these profiles do is they allow us to sort of shift the scale under the covers and get to a better color temperature. So I'll pick the infrared temp -100. That'll make the screen go crazy, and that's fine. And now, if I select the white balance picker and I still pick a cloud out here, now you can see a couple things have happened. So first of all, I've got very nice white clouds that are happening here. And I've got a gold sky and then blue foliage. And this is the standard look. This is probably, I'm going to guess this was shot with maybe a 590 nanometer filter or something close to that. And this is the standard look you would expect from a filter like that. And Harold can correct us to verify what filter was used. But this is what you would expect with the look you would expect with a proper, what I consider to be a proper white balance, because we're taking the neutral colors in the images, things like the clouds and part of the mountains, and we're keeping those neutral white so the other colors can pop. The other side effect of this is if we go back over to the side, you'll notice that instead of being bottomed out at 2000, the color temperature is now 3400. And so this means that to me, this is another sign that you've got a good white balance, because you've got some play on either side of it. If you want to tweak it a little bit one way or another, then you could definitely do that. So, so we've got a good white balance, and people will often ask, which one of these should I use? It doesn't matter as long as you can get a white balance that's good within this range. Okay, so let's take a look here, so the next thing that we would typically do in an image, now that we have a good white balance, is decide, do we want to swap colors? And this is a common processing technique that happens with infrared images, is to swap colors, the reds and the blues. And you can do this. There's profiles that allow you to do this in Lightroom. You can do this in Photoshop. There's a variety of methods. Or you can not swap colors. That's a perfectly viable way to go as well. And some images work better with these types of colors. But for this demonstration, I want to swap colors. So I'm going to go into my my profiles here, the profile browser, and I'm going to select grid. I'm going to go down to my color swap profiles, and I'll scroll down a bit. And if I scroll down to the -100, so that'll match the -100 here, excuse me, you can see the 6 different color treatments that we have available. So I have a hue adjustment, an invert, a RB, which is a red-blue color swap, and then a couple other variations. So shifting the green channel to blue, shifting the green channel to red, or splitting the green channel between them. And you can pick whatever you like. You could pick one because you're looking to get a blue sky. You could pick one because you maybe want something more stylistic and you want something a little more different, or you want something a little off. Sometimes infrared looks good when it's a little off, but sometimes you just want a blue sky. So let's start with here and pick this treatment, this red-blue swap with a split. That'll give us a pretty good treatment. So we'll pick that. Okay, so now at this point, you've pretty much done the conventional IR things that need to be done, and now we can get into regular processing. So let's see how I would process this image. So we've got this beautiful sky. So the first thing that I'll do is click on masks up here in the upper right, the mask icon. And there's Lightroom Classic has a ton of new, and as well as Camera Raw, has a ton of new mask options available that give us a lot of flexibility. So the first thing we'll do is pick sky, which will do the sort of AI calculation of what the sky is. And when you're dealing with these selections, you kind of have a choice. You can either take them as is or you can tweak them. So one of the things that I'll typically do, I'll do a quick version of this, is I might tweak this. So I like the sky, but maybe it's the selection is bleeding into the mountains a little bit too much. So if I zoom in here, you can see that this green color is in part of the mountains. So what I might do is take that away by clicking subtract and then a brush. And let's say I want not much feather. And this is the kind of thing, lately, and then I'll just brush away the parts. I don't want auto mask on because I want to get all of it. This is actually where I find myself spending most of my editing now. Now that I've got the color swaps in Lightroom, I find myself spending most of my editing time creating masks, and that's okay. I mean, it would be like if you were doing the same thing in Photoshop, but it's just a lot easier to do in Lightroom. So I spend most of my time editing creating masks, and the amount of time I'll spend is just going to depend on how much I like the image. So if it's a really good image, then I'll spend more time. Otherwise, I'll spend less time. So there's a quick cut of the sky. You could even do the same thing in the water. So now that I've got this sky selected, the first thing I'm going to do is come down and probably add a little bit of dehaze. So just knock that down. And I especially like the masks because I can do more dehaze in the sky than I would have been able to do if I was applying it to the whole image, because it really makes the shadows very crunchy. So I like being able to do it just to the sky. The next thing I could do is do another mask. I'll do a linear gradient, and I'll draw up from the bottom and kind of try to deal with, figure out what I want to do with the water. So you've got a couple choices here. You could either, make the water extra sharp with an increase in texture and clarity if you wanted to bring that out, or you could soften it to make it blurrier. I'm going to make it a little sharper, I think, for this image. So a little bit more texture and clarity. Sometimes with reflections, depends on what I'm thinking about the image. Sometimes I'll boost the exposure a little bit to get it closer to match the exposure of the top of the image. Just depends on what I'm trying to accomplish here. Next, let's go to create a new mask and select subject. Kind of a crapshoot sometimes with landscapes, but look, at this time it actually did a pretty good job, although it picked up some of the mountains. So maybe I would go in and say subtract, brush, and then go in and unselect, brush over some of the sky there to get rid of that. And then looks like I might have to add. So if I zoom back in a little bit, you can see it didn't quite pick up the mountain here. So maybe I've got to do another add. You can do as many of these additions or subtractions to a mask as you like. The mask's not always going to be perfect, but it should get you close. So that gets me closer. Again, I would spend more time worrying about the edges later on. And now that I've got the mountain selected, I can do any adjustments that I want to do here. So maybe I want to add a little bit more texture, clarity, dehaze. Those are all really good. The other thing that's really nice about this latest update to Lightroom is the fact that you can now do curves within a mask. Before, you didn't have this ability, and so I could create. Well, I could just create a strong contrast here that'll give me a bit of a curve, and then I could adjust these individually to get the look that I wanted. So having this curve option, I think, is really powerful within Lightroom. And the last thing I'm going to do is deal with the foliage. So there's a couple ways that I could deal with this. One of them is a mask, and then one of them is HSL. Let's do the mask first. So if I go into the mask, I could do a color range, and this would allow me to select the colors that I want the mask to see. So I'll grab some of this brush here. Now you'll notice that it grabs most of the image based on the overlay. So if I scroll up to the top here on the right, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You can see this refine section, which allows me to refine what is being selected. And I can draw that down. Let me zoom back out. And in this case, I'm probably just going to take it down all the way because I just want it to grab that color and nothing else. But now it's done a fairly nice selection of the foliage. And now I can say maybe bring the exposure down a hint because it's a little too overblown. And if I wanted to, I could also adjust, maybe I want to adjust the clarity and texture a little bit more to give that a little bit more punch, or maybe the contrast. Now, the other thing that you could do in an image like this, let me close out the mask panel, is I could come down to HSL, and I can use this panel, and I could, using this picker, I could grab the image and just drag down. I'm on luminance here, the luminous portion, and drag down, and that's just going to darken up this a little bit, so it's just not so overexposed for me. And then find the balance you like. So there we go. That's pretty much what I would do to edit an image like this. You could spend more time with the masks, but this is a beautiful composition. I'm not sure I would change anything with the composition. Absolutely lovely shot. Congratulations, Harold. Fantastic. Okay, so let's move on to what's next. Let's see here. I've got some images up next, but what I'll do is I think I'm going to catch up on comments, and I'll let you guys enjoy this lovely image while I catch up on the comments here. Yeah, Harold mentioned that purchasing filters adds up fast. That's definitely another factor for whether you want to do a full spectrum conversion. You don't need to buy them all at once, of course. Yeah, Pepper, yep, commented on that as well. And I think the other factor you want to consider when thinking about a full spectrum is not just that you're going to need filters, but you're going to need filters for the various sizes of lenses that you have. And so that can be challenging. And sometimes step-up rings are a good solution for that. So you can buy one set of filters for all your lenses, but sometimes step-up rings have their own challenges as well with vignetting and other problems. And so that's kind of a problem. And so that, again, that's another reason that I like another benefit to having a conversion to a specific filter is that I just don't have to worry about filters. But you can't do every kind of infrared with that method. So that's where it gets a little bit challenging. Okay. All right, so let's move on then. So next up, I have got some other images. Let me pull them up here. So let me find the next set of images. We've got a number of images that have come in from Waldemar, and this is a collection I looked at the last live stream that we didn't quite get through, but so we'll cover these again. Let me find them in Lightroom. Okay, here we go. And what we've got here is a couple images. We've got 3 images to critique and a couple to edit. So let me pull these up and we'll talk about these. All right. Switch here. Okay, so here's the first image. And my first observation, couple observations here. So I love the sky. The clouds are great. Excuse me. One of the things that you'll notice when you do really heavy color manipulation, especially with trees, is that you can get a lot of fringing, and that can definitely be problematic. Let me. Oh, this is maybe it's just a lower resolution shot, which could be the issue if this is 100%. Maybe it's just that I'm looking at it too close. But you may notice some fringing here around the trees and some color fringing around the edges. So this can be definitely challenging if you do too severe of a color change to an image. Then you can run into challenges with the color. The other, I like the color, the neutral color of the rocks in the foreground. There's green off here in the distance. I'm not a big fan of green in infrared simply because I think that most, the nature of infrared is it's not capturing green. It's sort of devoid of green. That's kind of one of the hallmarks of infrared. So but that's a personal preference. You can do, it's false color. You can do whatever you like. And so I would be careful with the amount of color manipulation you're doing if you've got these rough edges, because I've had images where I wanted to do more color processing than I could because of the fringing between leaves and the sky is problematic. So let's move on to the next one. Oh, even better clouds here. I love the clouds, and I love the view in the distance. It's kind of same, thoughts about the green. Not my cup of tea, but to each his own. I guess the only other thing that I would say here is, to me, you've got these lovely clouds and you've got this beautiful stuff in the distance, but then the foreground is a little bit distracting. So maybe I would, you may not be able to crop it out, but I might, maybe use a brush to, oh, I think I've got a brush here from last time, to kind of cut down on this. You can see this is actually what it looked like originally, and there's just kind of taking a little edge off. So if you take a little bit of an edge off, then you'll be able to, you'll draw the eye more to the distance. And then maybe you also might want to do, I'll just do a little quick example here of, going off into the distance here, and maybe bringing up a dehaze a little bit to kind of clear up give it a little bit more contrast to the stuff in the distance, and maybe a little bit more contrast. You could play around with the mask, of course, to get that right. But when I look at an image like this, I think to myself, where do I want the eye to be drawn? Certainly the clouds are great and the distance is great, but I would wonder if the foreground's too distracting. But trust me, I've taken so many images that have similar challenges, so I'm very familiar with sometimes, the place where you're standing is you can't eliminate that stuff that's in front of you, and that's just the reality of it. I've certainly been there. Let's see. So next image. Okay, this one I made some changes to, so let me reset this one. So similar comment here, and I think the challenge with this one is I love the color of the trees, but again, for my preference, my style is I like the neutral things to be neutral, and rocks as green just doesn't quite do it for me. Now, so if I had an image like this, I would probably take the saturation, and I'm not sure what processing led to this point, but I would probably take the saturation of the rocks down, either eliminate it or just take it down slightly so that it's not fighting so much with the pink of the trees. Think about, sometimes you got to walk away from an image and come back. Think about what is the subject of the image. What do you want people to be looking at? And that should affect, brightness levels, colors. Those will help influence what you want people to look at. And so, of course, it's infrared, it's false color. You can do whatever you like, but you still want to make a nice photograph. So think about what it is that you're drawing people to. Okay. All right, so now we've got a couple images that we can edit. So let's take a quick look at these. We'll start from, again, I'll move a little faster now and we'll walk through the process. So I'm going to pick a profile, and I will use my picker to click on the surf, which I think is a nice and neutral color. I'm going to do, I don't normally do auto, but I'm going to do a quick auto just to kind of bring the levels up so we can see what that looks like and deal with that here. We've got some spots. This is something that I fight with all the time, is getting rid of spots in my images. When you're changing lenses, infrared filters, you got to get rid of these things. So it's a bit of a hassle. So just another thing you got to deal with. So we won't change all of those, but that to me is an important thing to work through. I'll show you a quick tip. One of the things that I do is I'll switch to 100%, start in the upper left-hand corner, and then using the spot healing tool over here on the right, I will then pick off what I can see in the view. So I've got a couple spots here, and then I'll just simply hit the page down. Maybe this is one too. I can't really tell if that's one. I'll hit the page down key and then work through the image. So is this a spot? Is that there? I don't know. It's distracting. Let's get rid of it. And then you can kind of work through the image, and then it'll automatically cycle through. You can do page up, page down. You could zoom in further. You could zoom into 200%. It's a good way to work through the image. So if you've got an image you really like, sometimes you're not going to see those spots at full screen, and you've got to zoom in to be able to see them. Oh, there's another one on the beach. So, but you're not alone. I certainly have to deal with this all the time. I've been on shoots where I'll, get back after shooting a few hundred images, and I'm like, oh no, there's spots on all of them that I've got to deal with. You can actually even, if that happens, you can actually even save your spots as a preset. You could go into, click, create a preset, and you could eliminate everything, check none, and then you could just do, let's see, you could just pick out, where is it? Where are the spots? Oh, I'm not seeing them. They're here somewhere. I believe there's a way to pick spots. Maybe not. Maybe that's something you can't pass on. Oh, well. Okay, so I've got my image white balanced, and I've taken out care of the spots. And now, again, you've got the choice whether to swap or not to swap. We'll swap the colors on this image. And I'll come down and look at the profiles that I have available. You can use these color swap profiles. You could go over to Photoshop and do it. So I'll pick, you could pick, I tend to like look at these and try to figure out what's the mood I'm going for. So if I want something really playful, maybe I'll take this one that shifts the green to the blue channel. If I want something that's a little more unearthly, maybe I'll shift to the red channel. It just depends on what you want to get out of the image. What are you trying to drive at? So let's just do the red-blue swap for this one. And then now I would go through the same process that I did with Harold's image. So, we would do a sky, look at pull up a sky, and hit up some dehaze here. My very common practice is to dehaze the sky, and then I will typically right-click on this mask and do a duplicate and invert, especially in an image like this where it's just the sky and then everything else. And then now that I've got everything else selected, I will do a typically texture and clarity, maybe some contrast. That could be here with the tone curve. That could be up in contrast itself. You might also want to look at a little bit of dehaze, maybe not as much as I would do in the sky, but to play with that. There you go. So now I've got some more interesting, colors and contrast going on here. Maybe I want to figure out, do I want to, use a brush and brush part of the image to punch that up a bit, or maybe crop some of the image, so you can kind of make those kind of standard choices from this point going forward. All right, let's take a look at one more. From this collection, we will set a white balance, grab our temperature, click the sky, very dark. We'll bring up this one was underexposed by almost 2 stops. So we'll get the contrast up. Again, beautiful clouds and trees. I will, let's see, we will swap colors, go into the profile browser, pick the kind of color theme that I'm looking for. What's interesting, another thing that's interesting about color swapping is it really kind of depends on the sky. So in an image like this, where you don't have as much sky, you certainly don't have to color swap. We could just, go back to picking, one of these. If we said, oh, we like the blue for foliage, then that could be the way to go. There's no sky, so the sky's not going to look wrong if we don't color swap this. So again, there's probably maybe, I don't know, 10% of my images where I don't color swap at all because I like the tones that are there. And maybe that's because I like the sky, or the sky doesn't need to be blue, or whatever the reason might be. So let's just pick one of these. Maybe I'll do invert on this one. Now, same process. Start with sky, and we'll grab that, do a little bit of, wait for it to catch up, scroll down and do a dehaze, kind of. This is a very nice dramatic sky, so I might really punch this up. The other thing you might do is, there's a little bit of orange in the sky. So you've got a couple choices here. You could either adjust via the color temperature in sort of the opposite direction. So if we go, so we want to add blue, but because we've swapped colors, we're gonna have to go to the yellow side to do that. And so we could go a little bit to the yellow, or the other solution, if I just center this off, would be to just reduce the saturation. So if I just pull the saturation down, then that'll pull some of that color in the sky. It depends. Maybe you like the color in the sky. Maybe that adds to it. But you can use saturation and temp and tint. Maybe I want to add, purple to the sky, or green. I could do those things. And that's just, again, love the masks because they give me that flexibility to go in and say, oh, I want this sky to be a little bit purple. And you can do that. And then I can go in and edit the rest of the image. Well, I could do a duplicate and invert to do that. And then make my changes here. Same kind of stuff, deal with texture and clarity. And then at this point, you've got some more decisions to make about what's your subject. Do I want people to focus on this rock formation here? Maybe that's a little dark and it could be brightened up. Or maybe I want people to focus on the light hitting the mountains in the distance. And so I would need to maybe add a little dehaze to those. So you could just, go in and spend some time like we did previously, bring a brush in, kind of grab some of this. I'm just doing it very rough here, but you'll be able to see that by bringing the dehaze in really kind of, punches up that area. I'll clean it up a little bit. I can't help it. Oops. Got to go to erase. And we'll just get this out. There we go. So you could work on this, and again, spending most of your time with the mask to get that right, and then you could clean that up and add some punch there. So you could also, maybe you want to diminish what's in the foreground here, so you could brush this out, or you could do a radial gradient and bring this down. You got to be careful when you're doing dodging and burning. I tend to limit myself to about a third of a stop, depending on what I'm going after. So you can tweak this some more to get this to be what you like. But this would be the direction that I would work on an image like that. Okay, so thank you so much, Waldemar, for sending these images in. I really appreciate it. All right, so let's move on here. I will switch over and let me catch up on comments and see what's going on here. I have a used IR camera. Can I tell what conversion I have? This is from Robert. Can I tell what conversion I have by looking at the sensor? All right, let me show you a trick that I have for that. So let me find. Let's see here. I'm going to pull up a browser here. I'm going to show you that a trick that I use that it's been pretty successful for me. I mean, if you know what you're looking for, you get used to doing it by eye. But let's see here. I'm going to type in. I'm going to Google and I'm going to type in visible light spectrum, and then images. Here, let me show you my. Let me find the image I'm looking for. There's a really nice image from Encyclopedia Britannica. Let me find that image and I'll show you why I like it. Let's see here. Then we can get into the nitty gritty of why. Of course, now that I'm looking for that specific image, it's hard to find. Let's see. Let me find another one. And the reason that I like that particular image is of the visible light spectrum is because it has clear markings of the different wavelengths in nanometers, which is of course the measurement that we use. Okay, here we go. I think I found it. Yep. All right, so let me visit this and open up this image, and then let me switch over to it so you can all see what I'm looking at. So this is the image that I'm looking at. And so this is just an image you'd pull up on your computer. What I do is I pull it up on the screen here, and then I take the camera and I take a photo of this image on the screen. And what's cool, I mean, you're not going to capture any of the infrared light, of course, but it'll tell you where the cutoff is, because if you have like a 590 nanometer, and again, here's this line here, one up from the bottom, is the nanometer readings. And if you have a 590 nanometer camera, you will see that everything below it isn't captured because it's blocked by the filter. And then everything above it will be captured, and you'll see orange, red light. If you have a 720 nanometer filter, that line will appear up here somewhere in the red area, and everything else will not be captured because that filter will block it out. So this is a great way to take a camera that you've purchased, could be you got it used, could be eBay. Sometimes when you get a camera from like KEH, they don't list they say that it's infrared conversion, but they won't tell you the type. So this is a great way to go in and test your camera to see what it's done. And I've used this method to test not only cameras, but a whole variety of filters. I actually spent an hour one day, and I brought up this image and I put like every filter that I had on a camera, and I took a shot of it so that I could actually, validate and see that it worked, and it actually worked pretty well. So that's a good way to tell what kind of a cutoff you have when you don't know, when you simply don't know what it is, because maybe you bought the camera used and you didn't do the conversion yourself. So great question. Let's see here. Looking at the comments. Thanks for your videos. Scott had a comment on the profiles, which, you know, I hope they've saved me a ton of time, so I hope they save other people time. Do you have any experience with IR portraiture? If so, how do you adjust the eyes so they don't look so demonic? Well, I've done a little bit. I haven't done a lot of portraiture. One of the things that I do with the eyes is I typically actually don't swap colors. I typically keep the colors as is. I'll still do a white balance, and then I get kind of blue tones, blue eyes, and blue stuff. Let me find an image that I can share with you. This will take me a second to. I've got one in the book that showcases this as well. But let's see if I can find it quickly. One of the few portraits that I've done. So let's see here. Well, I did a self-portrait. The portrait of me in the book is a self-portrait that was actually in infrared. I didn't say that in the book, but it's that's actually infrared. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So this is an example. This is an example of a portrait that I shot, and you could see, you know, yes, you could see the eyes are very strong there. If I was to actually switch over and let's say I developed this differently, and I wanted to, you could see I just have the profile here. If I wanted to color swap this, then yes, I imagine it would look a bit demonic. These colors would be a bit crazy, which is why I kind of favored the blues. I did a bunch of testing on, you know, barely willing family members of some portraiture type stuff. And you know, it's challenging. It's challenging to shoot portraits with infrared. I found, you know, ultraviolet to be really interesting, but infrared is very challenging. And so like converting to black and white, I think was a big help, or using a 720, trying to keep the colors down, or not, you know, color swapping like this, but instead, you know, keeping the colors blue. That's kind of the method that I would lean towards. I think I've got another one here. Yeah. So again, so I've got keeping the blue tones, and not switching is that's the thing that keeps it from being demonic. Or of course you could switch to, you know, monochrome, and then that would give it a, you know, kind of a dramatic look as well. So that would be what I would do to deal with portraiture. And I'll probably be doing some more in the future. I want to shoot some more samples. It's challenging to find willing subjects. You know, when I say to family members, "Hey, I want to shoot some photos of you," and you're probably going to look terrible, I think maybe I need to work on my pitch. I don't think my pitch is very good. They're not big fans of it. It was a stretch to get family members to participate in my ultraviolet shoot. I think I just kind of sprung it upon them and didn't ask any permission. I just took the pictures. Let's see. Scott. Hey, Scott, how you doing? Long time no see. Let's see here. Just reading some of these comments here. Okay. Okay, just kind of reading through. I find the 650 nanometer harder to edit. Any thoughts on what I should think about when using this filter? So I've shot everything from 550, 590. I think I've shot like a 665, which would be similar, 720, 740. And, you know, my observation with this whole range of color filters is that basically what you're looking at is the more, obviously the lower the number, the more visible light that's coming in, the greater the color saturation that you'll have in your image. But aside from that, there's not a lot of differences between them. There's a little bit of difference when you get into from a 590 to a 550, because it you know, you're bringing in some oranges, some greens, and you've got to be careful what you white balance on. But aside from that, there's really not a dramatic difference. Now, when you get down to 470, that's when you got to deal with blues, and it's kind of a whole nother game. But a 650, it should be very similar to the processing of these other techniques. You should be able to take your infrared temp, -50, -100, and use those to get a good white balance. That's really the foundation for all of this, is, to me, is getting a good white balance. Once you have a good white balance, then you can kind of just do anything. So that's what I would focus on, is making sure that you get a good white balance. Okay, let me move on to the next set of images that we have. So let me get these queued up here. Let me go back to my folder where I have these stored. Now that I'm going off script and running around looking at old images, now I got to find where I was. Okay, so the next set of images that I have is from, let's see, it is from Prabhakaran. I knew I was, see, I practiced pronouncing this name and I knew I was going to mess it up anyway. So it's Prabhakaran, I think. I'm close. Sorry for the bad work on your name, but let's take a look at your images. Thank you for submitting images. So we've got a number here that are all, we've got one JPEG image, and then a variety of and then like 4 other images to look at. Let's see here. So let me pull up one of these. So, and I'll get this loaded up. Alrighty here. Okay, so this is a JPEG that you sent. I'm not sure what you're going for here. If this was like a test shot, or maybe a checking for hot spots. If you're here, and you could note in the comments what the intention of this was, and I can come back to it. But let's look at editing some of the other images you've sent. So this is a really nice composition. Let me start again with getting some kind of a white balance. So I'll go with the -100. I don't know what we're going to need here. This one's going to be kind of interesting. Oh, I was able to get a good white balance here with 370. Let's pull myself up here. And so I've got some images that are in some ways not exactly like this, but I love the way that the tree contrasts with the sky in an image like this. It's absolutely beautiful. The challenge is that it makes it really difficult to do any kind of masking with an image like this. So beautiful image, but super challenging to mask. So I've got these lovely colors here. And let's do a color swap now that I've got a good white balance. And in this case, I white balanced on the structure, because that's, to me, that is the most neutral element that I have here. And then I can come down and look at the colors, and you can play around with some, see what the different color treatments would look like. This might actually be one where this sort of purple yellow could be kind of interesting. Let me pick that up. And now this is, like I said, this is going to be more challenging, because if I go to my mask and try to do a sky selection, then it's going to be challenging to get an exact sky. So it might be tough to do this, and I would, let's see, if I do a dehaze, you're gonna have to be careful. So you might have to be really careful with selections like this. Let me do a gradient from the bottom, because I think that's something you could do, although maybe I would probably actually brush in all this grass area down here, and sort of decide what I want to do that. Of course, again, the key here for an image like this is, what is your subject? What do you want people to be looking at? Do I want them to be looking at this structure? If that's the case, I probably need to come in here and maybe, bring up the shadows a bit, so that I can get more detail there, maybe increase the contrast, come down to the tone curve, add some detail there. You could also brush in the structure and deal with that, specifically. So that would be one way to deal with this. You could either leave the foreground as is, you could brighten it, you could darken it. So it kind of depends on what you want to look at. What do you want the subject to be? Obviously, you've got the subject in the background, but there's definitely a lot happening here. Also, I might consider maybe even cropping in on this image. Maybe coming in from, this side a little bit. Let me lock my aspect ratio. coming in from this side a little bit. I mean, I'm not saying you got to get in the center, but these are things to explore, right? As you're thinking about this. Sometimes when this is me, this is not this image. Me personally, sometimes when I am out shooting, I get the composition wrong, or I don't get the balance quite the way I want, and so sometimes I will have to make an adjustment. So these are some things to think about when you're looking at an image like this. But once you've got your white balance and your color swapping, then you can continue to work on from there. Okay, let's look at the next image we have here. Oh, this one's really interesting because we've got this very sharp contrast between the sky and the foreground, the silhouette. So let me come in and try to see if I can get a white balance here. This is going to be tricky. And this is the kind of an image where, I think the kind of normal rules go out the window. So if I white balance, and if I just crank up the shadows just for a second, so we can see what we're dealing with in the foreground here, you could see I can kind of white balance on this structure. You might want to decide, do I want to, bring up maybe this patch of grass here or any of this foreground, or do I want the whole thing to remain as a silhouette? You've got a lot of creative choices here. And with those creative choices, it means you don't need to follow the standard pattern of how to process an infrared image like we've been doing. You could adjust the color temperature of the sky to different approaches because maybe you just want to go for a specific color you're looking for. Oh, maybe I really like a bright orange, or I want something closer to a sunset. You can play around with all of these things. You're not going to have your typical landscape of sky, clouds, foliage in an image like this. I think you have a lot more flexibility. You could also come down into HSL and make changes here. So I could use the hue, grab the sky, and I could make further adjustments up here if I wanted to, back and forth, whatever you were looking for. Though that's another approach. And then additionally, let me show you one more approach to managing all this color. If I go back, and I'll set the white balance to the kind of standard approach. The other thing you can do is come into the calibration panel, and you can adjust these primary colors. So if I adjust the red hue, that's going to have an impact mainly on the saturation, but you can play around with these others as well and get different results. So this would be another way the blue's having dramatic effect. So you could use any of these methods to tweak the colors. You could adjust the color temperature. You could adjust the HSL. You could adjust calibration, and then you kind of just have to decide in an image like this: do I want to see any of the foreground? Is it worth recovering any of those shadows, or do I want this to be a more dramatic silhouette? I don't know that there's a right or a wrong answer there. I would, I'd bring up the shadows and see if there's anything worth grabbing. Maybe you just bring them up a hair just to bring out a little bit of detail. And then of course, kind of clean up the sky a little bit. But I actually kind of like the drama of this being a silhouette. But this is not traditional in the sense of standard IR processing. I think you have a whole variety of choices for how you'd process an image like this. Okay, so one more here. So we've got a couple people in the shot. That should make it interesting. But we've got some challenges with this haze and the light here. So let's see what we've got. So if I do pick up one of my profiles and try to white balance on the rocks, okay, now I can start to see some of the colors separating out. I'm seeing the gold in the sky. I'm seeing the blue in the foliage, and of course in the people. Because there's people, you're going to have to think about how are the different color treatments going to treat them. So let's see here. Hue. This is another thing you look at. So when you think about the hue and the invert as methods to color swap, they actually produce very similar colors, but they do different things with the shadows and the highlights. So if I look at the hue, you can see, that say the shadows might look a little bit more washed out. And if I switch to, or actually the shadows are more contrasty, the highlights are more washed out. If I switch to invert, then you see that different stuff happens there. So these are all things you could edit with other tools, but you could compare the differences between hue and invert to see if one of these, if you liked one of these better than the other, or you could look at these sort of other styles to see what works, what treatment. I'm going to go with hue for this one. Now this image is kind of tricky because you've got all of these layers of um, haze that are happening in the image, which could mean that you might have to, if you want to address that with the dehaze, it could affect what you're doing. Or if you want to keep that separation between the background and the subject, you could look at that as well. So when I look at an image like this, the first thing that I'm going to do is see what can I get for free from the masks. So if I do a sky or if I do so sky actually looks pretty good. Now, of course, you don't have a lot going on in the sky here. There is not much. It's pretty evenly overcast. You don't see a lot of texture in the clouds, and so a dehaze. Oh, what it does is it shows the spots on your sensor. So this is not an uncommon challenge. So you could use that to help find the and clean the spots off your sensor. But like from a photographic perspective, there's just not much going on in the sky. You could even go in the other direction if you wanted to wash it out more. If I pick up the subject, we'll see what that does. That might bring up these subjects in the foreground. We'll see. Cross your fingers. Okay, that's interesting. I like how there's this harsh line that gets selected here in the bottom. You could, if you wanted to just pick the subject, you could do a subtract brush, and then you could brush away all the parts that you didn't want selected. That might be a quick way to keep the selection that you like, but get rid of the rest of it. And then once I've got that, then I could go in and say, okay, well, maybe I want to, bring up the shadows, bring up the contrast a little bit. So whatever you wanted to do, you could even bring up the exposure a hair, maybe. You just have to be careful with that one. Whatever you wanted to do there, and then you could think about the rest of the image. So if I select, what's interesting here, I'm going to do a select background and see what that does. I'm not expecting good results. That's actually not terrible. It actually kind of picked up everything except for them and this thing in the foreground. So if you wanted to work that way, you could. Let's say, and actually a quick way to do this is you might subtract and a linear gradient, and that would get you to just kind of pull everything off there. That would be a quick way to kind of remove that. And then maybe if you wanted to do a little dehaze or play with this one's going to be a little bit tricky. You might have to decide, where you want to go with this image and what, if I do too much dehaze, then I lose some of that contrast with the foreground. So I don't want to do too much. But this is a kind of a fun image. So you've got some choices here, but also the kind of image where you might spend a lot of time masking. Let's see, I've lost count here. Let me see if this is the last image in this sequence. I think maybe it is. Let me pull up my list here. Oh, I think there's one more. All right, let me switch over to one more. This one's going to be something entirely different. All right, let's switch over, and this is going to be a monochrome image. So let's take a look back at what this looked like beforehand. Actually, I'll just hit reset. See if I can reset this, or maybe this might be the filter that it came with. So let me browse here and just pick up like an Adobe Raw. So this is what it looked like in camera. So this could have even been a 590 nanometer or something similar in this kind of an image. So we've got a lot of color here, but again, there's the sky is flat. I kind of like the idea of taking it to monochrome and seeing what you can do there. So what I would do, again, is get out the masking, and I would start picking off various areas. So I'd pick the sky as one, and then that would give me control. Do I want to darken it, or do I want to just sort of blow it out to just draw attention to this subject? You've got some choices there, but you're going to get a pretty good mask with the sky there. The other thing that I would do, let's see here. Let me just play with this for a second and see what I can get. See, it's already kind of. I might even just think about just blowing it out entirely. That's one way to approach this. And then I would probably look at the ground, but this is probably going to require a brush. and go through and pick off the edges. I would do a more precise job here, pick off the edges, and then decide what I want to do there. Do I want to um, brighten that as well, or maybe darken that? Whatever I would feel would be the approach to draw in the structure. Let me take a step back though, because one of the things that I want to do with a monochrome image is really explore the filter that I would use. So I will typically, of course, I'm not doing color swaps. I'll typically look at this B and W group that exists down here that comes with Lightroom, and I'll look at the various treatments that can come out of an image. And I'll see which one of these suit my image the best, the way that it deals with shadows and highlights and contrast, depending on what my objective of the image is. And then I'll pick one of these as a starting point. So let's say I liked, one of these, kind of number 2 here is kind of a little bit higher contrast. So I use that as a starting point. And then really a lot of this is going to be just masking and going in and deciding, what parts of this I want to focus on, what am I interested in, what do I want to stand out. Maybe I want, some of the stuff on the side to kind of fall off into the distance. Let's see what a select subject does. Probably will pull up. This might be a good one for select subject. So I can get a good shot of the subject there. One of the things that you might do is, especially in an image like this, is do an intersection. So we showed the add and subtract for a way to modify a mask. Let me show you an intersection. There's a couple ways to do that. One way is to right click on the mask and say intersect with. And so in an intersection, I'm actually going to have 2 masks that come together, and I'm only going to use where they intersect. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is if you hold down the Alt key, you'll notice that between the add and subtract, let me zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. Between the add and subtract button, and if I hit Alt, it turns into an intersect button. So that's a quick way to get to that as well. So if I pull that up and I do an intersect, let's say I want to do a linear gradient. Now, I'm probably going to get this wrong the first time I do it because I always do it wrong once. I get it backwards. But let's say that I want to pull in, I'll go from left to right. We'll see how that works. Okay. All right. Oh, that worked well. So now what's cool about this mask is you can see that it's an intersection. It's a combination of the subject selection, which is what mask 3 was, and then this gradient. And so if you look at the mask up here, let's zoom in a bit. You can see that it's just covering the building but the gradation on the right side of the building. Okay, so now that I've got that, I could say maybe I want to bring down the exposure, but it's only going to do it on the far edge, the right side of the building here from this perspective. I can bring that down a lot, even a full stop, because it's a nice sloping gradation, and then that draws your eye over to the left side of the image over here where we've got more of the subject. And then the cool thing is I can still adjust this even though it's an intersection. I still have full control over it. I can adjust this separately or the other one separately, and you can intersect any 2 different kinds of mask. So I could bring this over even more, or I could bring the backside up more, and you could see it starting to have an impact. I find that this intersection works particularly well with architectural subjects. It gives me an opportunity to kind of play with them. The other thing that's cool is you could use an intersection with a curve now that that's available. So I could pick up a curve, and then I could really, hit the shadows and play around with different things with the curve. So this is a great infrared image. I think treating it as monochrome is the right way to go. And there's some really cool things you can do with the mask. You're gonna have to spend once you've got the profile you like, then spend your time on the masks, and then play around to get the look that you're looking for. Okay. Alrighty, let's move on. Let me catch up on the comments are. Let's see here. Do you have any recommendations for other YouTube photographers that you follow? So let's see, there's a couple. Let's see. Let me think of the names. I might pull up a browser um, to figure out what they are, because I will invariably butcher people's names and not get them correct the first time. But if I pull up my feed, I can try to get close. I mean, one of the obvious ones more recently is Thomas Heaton has done, I don't know, maybe 3 infrared now. He shoots 720 and tends to process black and white, not color. But that's somebody who you could look at. He's obviously sort of his big focus tends to be on composition. So that's a really good information. The other one who's done a number of videos recently that have been really cool is Matthew Stern. He's the master of weird lenses, and he's got some. He's done some videos on things like IR chrome and infrared video, and some of his stuff is really cool. So those are 2 people who've done infrared related videos on YouTube recently that I think are really good. Let's see. Newbie here. Could you work on a 720 nanometer filter, as I don't know what to expect with that? And I'm guessing that I can't get the amount of color, but would like to see the extent of what I can get. Sure. Let me find one here. Give me a second to kind of dig through my images. Oh, I've got one. There was another question. I think somebody else had a similar question. Let me look through my question database here, because I think somebody else had a very similar question. This was submitted by Carol. Hello, Rob. I shoot with a 750 nanometer filter converted Canon 400D camera. I'm now getting very confused as to the best way to edit my IR photos. I have your LUT version 2 pack and the Darktable IR presets, Photoshop. Would you do a complete edit during the stream so that I could take a look? So I'll do this in let's see. I'll do this in Lightroom, but I can touch upon some of the differences from some of the other programs. I've recently done a series of about 5 videos on Darktable, and that covers a lot of the basics for color swapping and contrast and things like that. So that's kind of a good resource there. But let me take a look at a 720 nanometer image, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the differences. So let me find an image here and get this pulled up. And we'll start with the end, and then I'll work backwards. Okay, so let me switch over to that. Okay, so this is an image that I shot on a 720 nanometer filter. And one of the things that you'll notice in this image is that the color in the trees is very subtle. So it's a very small amount of color. I've got a few different filters that I've used, and so it varies a little bit. So for example, I've got a Hoya filter that I use, a Hoya R720, which tends to produce it's a really good filter. It produces a very small amount of color. I also have a case 720 IR filter that I think lets in a little bit more visible light because I get a little bit more color out of it. So it's also going to depend on the filter. But in general, with a 720, you're going to get much more muted colors in the trees. So let me reset this, and we'll kind of start from scratch. So this is what it will, actually, let me go back even farther. I'll take a drink here while I'm doing this. Go back to what it looks like in the beginning. Okay, so this would be the look of an image, and of course, if I tried to do a white balance, I'm actually, oh wow, shockingly, I could actually get a decent white balance without using one of the profiles. That doesn't happen very often. So you can see here, I've got just barely 2150 over here. If we look over if I zoom in, you can see I just barely got a decent white balance. That doesn't happen very often. There's some cameras that it tends to happen more with, and some filters more with others. So you could definitely select that. With a 720, I tend to be using the -50 is the profile that I'll pick up. and then that'll give me a good white balance, a good color temperature selection here. So that's my first step. And with a 720, you're going to see very muted gold skies. You're going to see, again, almost white, but just a hint of blue in the foliage. So if I then color swap this, let me go down to my color swap images, and I'm going to use the -50s here. So these are going to have what hint of color is there going to be? So is it going to be a hint of like a magenta, a red, and a kind of a teal sky, or do you want more of a little bit stronger version of that, or maybe a standard? Let's go with the standard kind of RB split, which I think gives me a nice blue sky here. Okay, first thing that I have to do is take care of this dust spot, which is driving me mad. Dust spots drive me mad. Otherwise, I'm just staring at the dust spot. Can't do anything else till the dust spot's gone. I'd probably should go over the whole image, but that one is just screaming at me, Rob, make me go away. I'm a dust spot. Okay, so now looking at this image, so we've got a white balance. Our clouds look nice and white, and we've got some blue color in the sky. I think with this lens, I don't know. It's sometimes I might think that there's a bit of a hot spot. I'm going to try to zoom out a bit. My eyes are kind of telling me there might be a little bit of a hot spot here. There normally isn't with this lens. I don't know if it's my eyes. If there is, it's very broad. So one of the things that I would do with a very broad hot spot would be to go into masking and do a radial gradient. And I'm just going to pick up the area that I think that I'm seeing here. This is going to be super subtle, and it's really just going to be like a hint of a tint correction, like 10. I think that's good. Let me mark that on and off. So this is with the adjustment on. This is off. I don't know if you'll hang on. That's off. They they changed Lightroom, and it's no longer like a toggle. These light things, you now hold it down. So I'm sitting here clicking it, waiting for it to toggle, but they've just changed the interface. So now you have to hold it down. So okay, let's try this again. If I hold it down, that's off without the adjustment, and on with the adjustments. You can see just a hint. So there might be just a hint of a hotspot there. Sometimes I'll do that if I get an image where sometimes the center or just above center in the sky, I'm just getting a little bit of a color tweak that bugs me. You can see it here. And the other thing that you can do, let me turn off the masking for a minute. If you want to see that even better, is just crank up the saturation and vibrance, and that'll really help you. And now you can kind of see a bit of a halo here around the top of this arch. Now if I go back into the mask, now I could play around with this, and I could say, well, maybe it's smaller, maybe I just need to adjust it more. You could tweak this, and now the effects show up even more. So cranking up the saturation, the vibrance is a good way to help you deal with hotspots that are hard to see, especially when they're just a slight temperature shift. Sometimes you'll see a temperature shift between the center and the edge of a lens. Even with lenses that don't have hotspots, I sometimes see this, and I think it depends on the direction of the light, maybe some other factors. So sometimes I'll make a little correction like that. Okay, so let me go back and fix these colors, since I've now burned my eyes out on that over-the-top color, and get back to my regular edit of this. Okay, so now that the colors look more even to me, and I will say that's a subtlety that I would not have noticed when I first started doing infrared. That took a few years for me to be able to spot those subtleties. So if you're looking at this now going, what is he talking about? That's okay. I didn't notice it at first. What I've noticed is that as time goes by, my eyes have become more sensitive to color temperature changes. I see them now. It kind of reminds me, I had a period when I was shooting, before I was doing infrared, I was shooting like sports at the time. And I was talking to another photographer who was like preaching about the importance of white balance. And at the time, I didn't spend a lot of time. Again, this is just visible light photography. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about white balance. And then after this other photographer, said how important it was, something switched in my brain and I couldn't stop thinking about white balance. And then from that point forward, I like became very observant of the white balance in any image that I was looking at. Whether it was trying to get a correct white balance or what a change in white balance could do to alter an image. And I think that skill goes to even another level when you deal with infrared and you become accustomed to what slight variations in color temperature will do to an image. So again, if you didn't see that, you will grow to see it the longer you work with infrared images. Okay, so let's get back to the editing of this image. Again, getting back to the masks. So we'll start with a sky. Now, for me, when I'm processing a 720 image, I'm usually not looking to, I've shot it because I want the more muted colors. And so I've kind of accepted that. And so I'm typically not going to amp up the colors too much, if at all. I might, increase the contrast, and this might even, in fact, darken the sky like it's done here. So that's something you've got to be aware of. Do I want that, or do I want to, adjust that? So, but I tend to like the muted colors. I've grown to really like the muted colors of 720. And so what I'm looking for in the sky is to create contrast. So that could be maybe even bringing up the highlights, to punch up those clouds a bit, to kind of increase that contrast, or maybe doing a tone curve down here, to increase that contrast. So there's still a little bit of blue, and you could also deal with saturation if that was something that you're looking for. The next thing that I would probably do in an image like this is look at the subject, see how good the AI is going to select the subject of this arch, and let's see here. Actually does a pretty good job. I could come in and add to this edge here and maybe subtract some of the stuff in the middle, but it's done most of the work for me. So that's kind of a good start. So I would probably clean this up some more, but with something like this, I would probably really amp up, the texture and clarity to really bring some crunch into that, increase maybe a tone curve, maybe a strong tone curve, and maybe even some contrast. Sometimes I'll hit, multiple waves of contrast in an image like this. I mean, this would really it needs some punch, it's a big granite thing. So do that. And then, you could also, like we did with one of those earlier images, you could also do a color range, and try to just select the trees, and knock back the refinement. See, I didn't get this. This didn't do as good. That's another one of the challenges with 720 is that because those colors are so muted, you're going to have a hard time getting a color range that's interesting. So that might not work so well. But if I went to HSL, I could probably get what I wanted if I wanted to bring down the luminance of those trees. Let's see if there's any color. There's a little bit of color, just enough to be able to maybe darken those up a little bit. It's going to be tricky though. There's not a lot there in terms of color. So, yeah, and then couple more final touches. I might do like a linear gradient here to kind of darken up the sidewalk and draw more attention to the arch, and maybe another one over on this side, maybe even get rid of some of those footprints in the snow. But typically when I'm doing a 720 image, it's the same process that you would do for, say, a 590, but you're going to have more muted colors, and that's fine. You might want more contrast in other areas to accommodate that. But I actually like the look of a very muted blue sky. It's kind of a cool look for me. Okay, let's move on then. So this is what our final 720 looks like. Okay, so let me catch up here on comments and see where we're at. Let's see here. Pepper said, are the GFX lenses bad about hotspots considering a 50S later this year? So, I love the GFX 50S that I have, converted to full spectrum. The image quality is fantastic. Uh, the lens selection is challenging. Um, the best lens for that system is the 45 millimeter, um, 2.8, which is the equivalent of a lower f-stop on a full frame. Also, the 45 to 100 is also excellent with no hot spots. A little more expensive, a little heavier. The problem is, um, and of course, that 45 millimeter is the equivalent of a 23 millimeter on the Fuji crop sensor cameras, or the equivalent to a 35 millimeter on a full frame. The challenge is wide. So I'm going to be doing a video with a few videos. I've got one video coming up that deals with a fisheye lens that I picked up for the GFX system, which of course is, not standard. It's very creates very these spherical kind of things, but creatively interesting. And then I'm going to be looking at a bunch of adapted lenses. I've started to pick up. I have like 5 or 6 adapters for the crop sensor Fujifilm cameras, and now I'm starting to pick up adapters for the GFX system. And I've got like I think a Nikon adapter and maybe like a Minolta adapter. So I'm going to start to test vintage lenses, and I'm going to see if I can find vintage lenses that would get me a little wider anyway when it comes to that system. So I love that system. And like I said, the image quality is fantastic, but it's a challenge to find wide angle lenses. The wider lenses, the zooms are all terrible for hotspots. So some of the telephotos are great, like the 110, the 120, 200, I forget what they all are, but a lot of them are fantastic for the GFX system, but the wide angle is a challenge, like we talked about earlier. And so it's just, you see this a lot. I see this a lot. I see this a lot even with the Fuji crop sensors, that the great landscape wide angle zooms are terrible for infrared. It's frustrating. I wonder, it's probably the same with other camera systems as well. But it's challenging. It's definitely challenging. But I still love the system, and I'm going to keep working it till I find, the lens combinations that work for me. Harold, sometimes I see faint hotspots, like with reflected light off structures like that. And, that's become, I guess it's frustrating. There are lenses that I thought had no hotspots that I see this on. And so it's got to be some kind of reflected light or the angle of the sun. It still happens occasionally. That's why I think it's important to, even if you get a lens that doesn't have hotspots, to be able to know how to do those kind of corrections, those kind of hotspot corrections, or those color temperature corrections could still be important for some images. Do you shoot solely infrared, or do you still shoot normal color? So I would say the majority of my shooting is now infrared. But there's still some things that I do in color, not landscape anymore. So I used to do a lot of sports. And of course I haven't done as much sports lately. I've done some events, in the last few years, and most of my event photography, and I've done like, I don't know, maybe one wedding in the last 5 years or something. But most of my event photography tends to be, of course, visible light. But now most of my travel and hiking type photography tends to be infrared. So that tends to be my focus as of late. Let's see. Okay, so all right, let me move on to some more submitted questions. We covered that one. Okay, we've got another image. Oh, another nice image that I want to look at. So let me find it here. I'll do a time check here. Getting to be about an hour and a half in, as I suspected. Not going to get through all of this, but we'll get through a lot. Okay, all right, here's the image I want to look at. Give me a second here to pull it up. Okay, so this image was submitted by James, and I'm going to show you, the first thing I'm going to show you is my edit of the image, and then we will go back and we will start from scratch and figure out how we got here. So we've got these lovely clouds going on in this image. and these beautiful tulips. Um, and One of the things, there was another question that somebody brought up that I want to address with this image in particular. Let me find it. I think it was a question about, let's see. It was a question about seeing infrared, or pre-visualizing infrared, if you will, before you shoot it. And I think that this image really speaks to one of the key things that is hard um, in the pre-visualization of infrared. So you'll get to a point where you look at the clouds and you're like, oh yeah, those. I mean, you're going to look at the clouds and that's going to be easy to visualize. Yeah, those look cool. Mountains, that looks cool. Um, the challenge with an image like this is probably these tulips look very different in visible light. But not only that, it's the negative space. It's the gaps between these rows, these gaps here. Now in an image like this, um, my only sort of I love this image. My only critique is I wonder if a slightly different angle would get you would bring these into the image more, because these are kind of a dominant, these lines are a dominant element of the image. And this is the part, and I say this because this is something that I still struggle with, and I'm still trying to get better at while I'm shooting, is seeing these things. Like I can see the clouds, I can see the sky, I can see the foliage. Sometimes it's hard to see that, oh, you know what, that row is going to be really dark. That's going to be a dominant feature. So that's something that I'm trying to work on when I'm out pre-visualizing images. Let me reset this and walk through the process. Should be somewhat familiar by now. So this is what it might look like in camera, especially if you didn't have a custom white balance set in camera. Let's see here. And so we will, let's see, pick a profile. So I'm going to pick the -100 profile, and then I will attempt to white balance on the clouds. So that right off the bat, that does a pretty good job. I love white balancing on clouds. I think it's the most natural look. Other subjects, anything neutral. I'm not a fan of white balancing on foliage, and I know that was something when I first got into infrared. I read that a lot. White balance on the grass, white balance on the leaves, and I just don't think it produces the same look. Maybe with like a 7, and I think that advice is based on shooting with a 720 nanometer filter. That advice is probably fine because the difference, the amount of colors we saw in the last image is very small. But when you're shooting 590, I just don't like that. I think it's better to find something truly neutral, such as clouds, pavement, or something that's a normally grayscale devoid of color. If you shoot 550, it's essential, because now your filter is going to allow some greens in, and it's really essential that you get a good neutral white balance. So I will come in here and let me go into masks. As we've done, you're probably sensing a pattern here. I tend to start with the sky and figure out what I want to do with the sky. Now, in this case, I might actually want to bring the exposure up a little bit, because this image might be a hair underexposed, but I don't necessarily want to address the whole image. I want to start with the sky. So I might bring up the sky maybe 2/3 of a stop or so, and then go down to dehaze and add a little punch there. I never swapped colors, but that's one of the beautiful things about working this way in Lightroom, is that I don't need, I mean, I typically do that first, but I don't need to do that first. I could actually go in. Let's just do that. Let's go ahead and do all the kind of edits that I would do, and then we'll look at a swap. So I've done the sky. I could do an invert, duplicate an invert, which, look at that, that's pretty clean. And so I could come in and do a little bit of texture, a little bit of clarity, and now we're starting to really see that punch between, the rows and the flowers. This isn't. Let me show you one of the things you can do with the curves here. I can come in and I'm going to drop a couple points. And I'm going to drop more than a couple, so that I can. Well, let me take a step back. So if I don't have any points, and I just grab the line with a single point, I could start to have, kind of a broad effect on the brightness of all of this. But if I want to be more selective, I could drop a number of points. And if I just have 2 or 3 points, one of the things you'll notice is that, like, when you bring up a point, it'll bring down something on the other side. And so if I, let's say if I delete, let me delete this point. So if I've got just 2 points, if I bring up the brightness here, you'll notice the line dips underneath. And if you want that, that's fine. But if you want to control that and not have it dip, you can just add another point so it'll level out the line. So if I wanted to get in here and really, instead of just doing like one of the presets, if I wanted to really get in and control the contrast, I could do that by sort of adjusting these points. And I can look at both the image and I can look at this sort of histogram in the background to see, what I want this to look like and how I want this to be affected. So some images I'm now starting to play with this way, and really tweak the tone curve based on what I want to see in the image. And again, love the fact that you can do it in a mask now, so I could have it just appear in one spot and not in the whole image. So I can tweak this the way that I like. Okay, so that looks pretty good. All right, so I think we're in. I could also probably, again, you could also target the mountains, go in and do a little bit there. But let's just go do our color swap. You could keep these colors, or you could do a color swap. So let's go down and look, and I'll go down to my -100s and explore what this looks like. So you've got a super kind of overly vivid blue there with the hue, maybe a little bit more muted, desaturated blue with the invert. For a long time, I was a big fan of the straight red-blue color swapped. I love the sort of teal, the like just off blue that I get out of the sky. I love the just slightly surreal aspect. I mean, obviously the colors of the foreground are surreal, but I like having the sky be just slightly surreal. If you want a more of a true blue sky, then you could split the colors, or look at these different options. So I'm going to go with this one because I think that this works well. This shifting the green channel to the red channel, I think it works really well with these flowers. And now that I've done that, I'm seeing a couple different things. First of all, I think the clouds could even be brighter. So I can come into the clouds, which was that first mask, and I'm going to bring up I'm just going to bring it up to 1. We'll go a full stop up. The other thing that I'm seeing here is, you notice how, let me zoom in a bit. You notice how there's like a little bit of a pink underside to these clouds. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes you might want to address that. Now, there's a couple of ways to do that. You might notice that it's pink in the middle and it's a little green off to the edge. So one way to do it would be, you could do a blanket solution. So I could just say, take my mask of the sky, and I could just desaturate. Well, I can't desaturate because that'll affect, well, you can desaturate. It'll affect the sky as well. So if I desaturate, it'll pull that down, but it'll also affect the background. So you'd have to decide if that's what you wanted. The other thing that you could do is you could do a radial to try to just affect the middle. So if I did a radial gradient, and I drew it around this spot in the middle, then I could do a shift of the color temperature. Left is going to make it more pink, and the other way gets rid of that. Now that is, there's a little bit there, but now that it's mostly gone and it kind of matches the rest, I could come back to the sky variant, and I could tweak the whole thing in the same direction, and I could try to get rid of it all. So that's another approach that you could take. Finally, the last approach that you could take for something like this would be to do a luminance mask. So if I go in here and I do luminance range, I could pick what I want using this slider up here, or I could draw it. So let me just draw it here. This gets me my luminance range. And let me, now, of course, you can see it's going to cover a lot. So that's challenging. I could, try to hone in the settings here on the right to try to adjust this a little bit. Maybe to just try to get to the clouds. The other thing I could do is do another intersection. So if I hold down my Alt key and did intersect, I could intersect with the sky. That'll limit it to just the sky, and it'll have none of the effect on the foreground. So see, the overlay is not on the foreground. Now we're just in the sky, and now I could begin to tweak the sky, and this could be desaturating, or it could be a color temperature shift. Could be a variety of ways that you approach this. So one of the things that you'll begin to notice the more you do infrared, you'll start to notice these little color temperature shifts everywhere. They could be at the edge of your screen. They could be in the clouds. They could be in the shadows. I did a video on that a few months ago. They start to show it. You start to see them everywhere. Now, you don't need to correct them or fix them in every image, but it's something to think about, you know, because they're there in an image, and you have the choice as to how you want that to look. And so by choosing to adjust that, you can create a certain look. So just be aware of those. As your eye gets more accustomed to infrared, you'll start to see more of those little subtle variations that exist through an image. Okay, so that's good for that image. So let's move on. Let me catch up on the comments. Let's see here. Nope, James. Oh, excellent. You know, James' comment, I had many more from that day with the Rosemore printout. So yeah, definitely something to keep in mind. And again, that's not a criticism. That's just like me pointing out, you know, a learning that I've had in trying to see that stuff, you know, when I'm out there. But I think this is an excellent image, and I suspect that the others in the series are as well, because you've got great clouds and a great subject here. Do you have any advice regarding merging two different kinds of IR images? Let's say blending a full spectrum image with one that's captured with the 720 nanometer filter. So, not yet. That's the short answer. One of the things that's on my list to do is something that's very much like this, called that we would refer to as a multi-spectral image. And so, you know, the most common type of multispectral image that you're probably familiar with is astrophotography, that are things that are processed with the Hubble palette. So they'll take three images, you know, a hydrogen alpha, an oxygen 3, and then a silicon, I think, image, three separate images. Then they will apply a color to each one and then blend them together. That's basically a multispectral image. You can actually do the same with infrared. So for example, you could take one shot of something with deep infrared only, so like maybe an 830 nanometer filter. You could take another shot that's visible light. You could even take a shot that's ultraviolet, and then you could blend those together. Now, the challenge with that blending is going to be focus, because kind of what we talked about earlier with lenses, that the different focus points. And so trying to get those images to line up together is very challenging. And in the research that I've done, most of this is in the ultraviolet photography forum. I think it's ultravioletphotography.com. There's some discussion about multispectral imaging there. The big challenge is finding the right lens, because not only do you have to deal with hotspots, but you're going to have to deal with trying to get the images to actually line up from a focus perspective. And it's not just a matter of like, oh, shift it a couple pixels this way or that way. It's a matter of like the whole image may have to shift in or out. So you could be doing some sort of complex transforms in Photoshop in order to get that to work properly. So that's definitely, it's challenging. So I want to try it. I want to experiment a bit and see what kind of different things that I could come up with using different filters, because I've got a ton of filters now. Coming at some point, a more of a investigation into multispectral imaging. I think it's very fascinating. Let's see. Yep, another comment. I actually do have a dual narrowband filter that captures O3 and H alpha, and now I want to try that for landscapes. Yeah, I think I might have the same one. It's a dual band dual bandpass filter. Mine's from Case, so you might have the same one that covers those two. That would be a good one to try shooting landscapes with. I mean, obviously I know it was designed for astrophotography, but because it covers those narrow bands, it might be interesting to use that to shoot an image, and maybe even combine that with an image with like a deep filter. So that could be kind of interesting. Okay, so let me move on here. Let me do a time check, and we'll go a little bit longer. Maybe we'll go to the 2-hour mark. And actually, yeah, there was another. The next question that I had from my list was from Mac, which was, "What's your thought about a 1,000 nanometer filter?" And then the second part of that was, "What about combining an infrared image with an identical visible light image to later stack to be able to emulate various filters?" So again, well, I'll do the second part first since I've already answered that. Challenging with focus, but I want to try it to see how that works, and I'm curious what results I could get from that, and maybe not only dealing with the results and the focus, but what subjects would be interesting with that for. That's the part that I think is probably going to be just as challenging as the technical side, is figuring out what subjects would be good for that. And then the other part, have you thought about a 1,000 nanometer filter? I have not shot with a 1,000 nanometer filter. I'm planning to buy one, and I'll give it a try. My concern is that sensors. So digital camera sensors typically read from about 350 nanometers in the ultraviolet range up to 1,000 nanometers in the near infrared. The challenge is that because both of these extremes are typically filtered out by the hot mirror filter in the camera publishers don't publish the specs. They don't say, "Oh, our sensor goes up to this nanometer." They don't publish it because their assumption is that it's going to go higher than you can see, and they're going to cut it off with the hot mirror filter. So it's very difficult to find specs on what a camera will go up to. Will it go up to 1,000? Will it go up to 900 or 950? And then you throw 1,000 on there, 1,000 nanometer filter, and then you just lose everything else after that. I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that even if it does reach that high, you're going to end up with a very pretty low contrast image, because you're just going to get such a narrow slice of infrared light. But still, it is something that must be experimented. So I must buy one and experiment with it. And so I will definitely do that at some point to figure out, to get a more definitive answer to what happens with at least with my cameras, what happens on a full spectrum camera with a 1,000 nanometer filter. I had another image submitted from Mac who asked that same question. Is there anything you do different for my image during the shooting or editing process? So let me find that image, and then we will pull it up. Okay, here we go. And this is a JPEG. So let's get this loaded up, and we'll take a look at it. Okay. All right, so here's the image that Max submitted. So a few, and this is a JPEG, so there's going to be limits to like what I could do with this. But a few observations. I mean, this is the colors are very dramatic, but putting that aside, this is actually a very lovely composition. It has really good lines. There's these lines going from, upper right down, lines coming from upper left down, these slope. In fact, let me do this. Let me switch over to monochrome so you can kind of see, the image actually kind of looks better. It allows you to see the lines in monochrome better. So I actually think this is a really lovely composition. So let me state that first. Now, as far as the color goes, the color is very bold, and this is not, sort of my style because of what you've got going on here. I think with the color of the sky, my guess is going to be that I don't know if you had a filter that would adjust the color temperature, because I'm still seeing not only red in the sky, but I'm seeing a lot of red in the clouds. And that's going to be difficult. That's not a look that I'm a fan of. That might be more like for some images, more dramatic. I think the challenge with the colors in this image is that it makes it hard to know where to look. You know, you've got these beautiful mountains, but this soft sort of mint color in the mountains, but then you've got this, you know, sky that's screaming, "Look at me!" And so it for me, it makes my eye confusing of what to look at. Whereas I think with a more natural sky would allow your eye to focus on this beautiful, you know, hillside, mountainside landscape. So for me, I would probably try to get more of a natural look in the sky, kind of like we've done with some of the other images in this series. Get a white balance that is more neutral. I'll do a little bit of a quick edit to show you what I'm talking about. Although there's going to be limits because of the fact that it's a JPEG, we're not going to get a full, you know, change. And even the sky, wow, the sky filter is totally confused by your red sky here. So trying to even get that, let's okay, let's not do that. Let's just do a gradient here. It's funny with infrared because of course these AI filters, you know, they're programmed to think, oh, a sky is blue or it's golden or whatever. And when we throw some of our crazy infrared colors at it, the AI is like, what? That's not a sky. It doesn't know what to do. So if I look at this so I've just done a quick gradient, and if I come over to the color temperature and make some adjustments to it, there's a limit to what I could do because a lot of that color is already baked in. So yeah, I'm not going to be able to do a lot with this because it's a JPEG. But my first observation. Let me do this. Let me just reduce the saturation a little bit. So you'll be able to like see just reducing the saturation, and of course it's not perfect because it's a gradient here, but just reducing the saturation a little bit allows you to see, like, it takes some of the focus off the sky and it puts it back on this mountain, which I think is more interesting. Now, the rest of the image, I think again the colors, processing of the colors. You know, I would love to see the raw on this, and the direction that you could go, because I really do think it's a lovely composition. But the color of the foreground is not bad. This sort of a soft, maybe mint green teal color. Not too bad. Actually, there may just have not be a color swap here. That may be, you know, kind of the way it was shot, without any kind of a color balance. But I think you've got some interesting things happening in the landscape here. But again, for me, it's just the color is it's too dramatic. If I was to swap, I'm gonna go crazy here for a second and just swap colors, using the JPEG color swaps. So this actually starts to get you an idea of what this image could look like. So you've got, you know, maybe a little bit more of a natural blue sky, although I did have the gradient that cut down on that a bit. You've got some more interesting colors in the foreground. Although honestly, I would probably, the foreground is very bright. What I might do in an image like this is just bring another gradient up, or maybe even paint up from the bottom, bring the exposure down, a little bit, and then try to draw more attention to the mountain in the background. So that could be done with a brush or some kind of a radial gradient. Get in here. I think this is kind of the interesting part of this. And if you could bring that up a bit, maybe bring up the exposure or use things like texture and clarity, you could bring that up a little bit more. So I think this is a lovely image, but the colors, it just looks like there wasn't a good sort of, in my taste, a good sort of white balance applied before. And then, you know, this might be a case where a color swap works, or this just might be an image where just sort of desaturating the whole thing actually works. Maybe a very subtle amount of colors really allows the contrast in the subject to really pop out. So I think there's a great composition, a lot of potential here. All right, so let me see what's going on in the comments here. Okay. Some good conversations going on. Okay. All right, so let me quick time check. We'll go about 10 more minutes. Let me find what's next on my list. Um, Oscar had a question about dealing with hotspots in post. I work with Lightroom Classic. Thank you very much. So I want to show you a couple images that involve hotspots, and I want to show you when you can work with hotspots and when you cannot. So let me find those images. So let's see here. Where did I put those? Give me a moment here while I find them. Okay. All right. I think I stored them in another folder. So give me a moment where I find these hotspot images. I know I put them somewhere. Okay. All right. So there's a couple different scenarios that I've dealt with for hotspots. Let me show you. Let me show you one. Let's start with the one that's really difficult to work with. Okay, let me pull this up and share this so you can take a look at it. Okay, and this was an image. Transition over here. This was an image that I deliberately shot with a lens that I knew had terrible hotspots. And if we look at it, let me zoom in a little bit. If we look at this hotspot, I mean, this is the kind of hotspot that you're just going to want to avoid because we've got both, you know, a kind of an outer ring here. We've got a tighter area here, and then we've got some weird flaring coming out the side. I spent some time trying to fix this hotspot. Let's cut to the chase, and we'll go back and look at what I was able to do. So this was after me spending, I don't know, probably 15 or 20 minutes trying to fix this hotspot, and you could see that, you know, it's still terrible. And let's pull up the mask so you can see what I did. So I started with a very tight mask to try to address this super bright spot. I came up with kind of another broader mask to deal with this bigger thing, and then another one to deal with some broader stuff. And then I think at one point I was even, you know, using a brush and trying to brush these sort of flares out and figure out a way to deal with those. So you can see this. Oh, that's not too bad, but like this is super fiddly. And this is in an image where I deliberately shot against a dark subject so that you could see how difficult it was. And so this is the kind of hotspot that you just want to avoid. And this is again a severe one. I think this is my Fuji XF 60 millimeter macro, which is just terrible. It's my favorite lens for deliberately shooting hotspots because their hotspots are so terrible. And this is probably like f/22 as well, so it just makes it even worse. So these are the kind of hotspots you want to avoid. Now because they're just so hard to clean up. Now let's talk about the kind that you could actually edit. So I've got another image that I want to share that has, let's see, where did I keep that other image? Let me go back to my folder of all the images that I collected for this live stream, and I think I have one in there. Okay, so all right, let me pull this up. Take a look at this. Okay, so here is an image that this is like a test image that I shot with a specific lens, and you can see there's clearly a hotspot, but it doesn't have the severity and the challenges, and also there's a much broader ring that's happening here. So if I bring up, let's start by just bringing up the exposure about a stop, and you can see this now. If I was to tackle a hotspot like this. Oh, and actually I'm zoomed in a little bit so you can, there we go. So now you can see this tight inner ring and you can see this outer ring. So now let's look at how we would address this kind of a hotspot. So the first thing that I would do is let me actually zoom back into 100% because I want to deal with this inner one first. So we'll do a radial gradient, and I'm going to draw that to be as close as I can to the size of that, and then bring down the exposure. Now, sometimes, and you might have to tweak back and forth to get it right, you can also use that the eye tool. Remember, hold it down, off, on. You can play, I could even go like in very tiny increments to get it right. I'm not going to spend that much time doing it, but you can see that I can kind of like get rid of it. And the nice thing about this is because this is a mask, this one I know I could save as a preset. So I could save this as a preset. Now, if I go back to this wider view, I could create another radial gradient. And sometimes it's hard to do two of them right next to each other. So sometimes I'll draw one and then maybe move it so they're kind of over top of each other. Now, you got to play with, not only do you have to play with the exposure or sometimes the temp to get these, but sometimes you have to work on the feathering as well. That's where a lot of the time comes in. So let's say I've got this one and I start to tweak a little bit. You can see that's pretty close, but I might need to like increase the feathering, and I can look at the preview kind of in the upper left to kind of help me. Now I could spend a fair bit of time, tweaking the feathering and the exact brightness to get this where I need to be. And I can probably do a pretty fair job of eliminating these. In fact, if I, just from this point alone, if I hide the masks, all of them, you can see them come back. So these are the kind of hotspots that I have successfully eliminated. So in particular, I did this with images shot on my iPhone. I was able to successfully remove them and then save that as a preset and then just apply them to everything shot with that same lens or lenses, because it was two of them. And these are the kind of hotspots you can fix. So you've got to be careful. I mean, I generally recommend to people to just avoid lenses that have hotspots. But as we talked about earlier, sometimes there's going to be weird flaring in the sky. Sometimes there's going to be little shifts of temperature. Sometimes this adjustment isn't just an exposure. Sometimes there's a little bit of a temp adjustment as well. And you could play with color to try to figure that out. So you could say, I could crank up. This might actually be shot with like an 830. So there might not be a lot of color shift in this particular image, but I could crank up the vibrance and saturation, and I could do little tweaks with the temp slider to see if that helps me to eliminate them. If you get super close with exposure, then I'll shift over to temp. So, but these are the kind of hotspots you can work with. But those ones that are like offset with flaring and all kinds of stuff, those are the ones that I just wouldn't mess with. So it's a good skill to have, to know how to clean those up. It's mostly radial gradients with exposure changes and temp changes. That's the main thing. If it needs more than that, it's probably not a lens that I would want to shoot infrared with. It's probably just too much trouble. Okay, so let me catch up on comments here and see where we're at. Some more conversation here. Here's a question from Cameron. What is the relationship between hotspots and aperture? Does a wider aperture increase the amount of hotspot? It's actually the opposite. Wider apertures tend to have fewer, sometimes no hotspots, and narrower apertures or higher f-stop numbers tend to have other apertures. Let me find an example to see if I can show you an example. I might have a series here. When I was doing these hotspot tests. Okay, so here's a quick example we'll take a look at. So you can see this series of images, just this row in the middle here. Let me just make the thumbnails a little bit bigger. Okay, so it'll be sort of the series is starting here. This is, and again, this is that 60 millimeter that's got the terrible hotspots. So this is at 2.8. This is the widest. I think it's actually 2.4 lens, but this is 2.8. And you can see progressively as I work up a full stop at a time up to f20. here's a f16, f20, they get progressively worse. So there are some lenses where a wide aperture will you'll see them completely eliminated. Um, and so anything wider that number, that f number or smaller, will produce no effective hotspots, whereas higher numbered f stops will produce hotspots. So that happens with some lenses. Some lenses they'll range from having no hotspots to some as the aperture gets more narrow, as the f number gets higher. Let's see. Checking comments here. Okay, so it is now we're 2 hours in, so I think this would be a good spot to break. I have gotten through, oh boy, maybe a third of everything that was submitted. So I'll definitely set up a schedule for another session, and we will keep working through all the questions and all the images that everybody has submitted. I want to thank everybody for stopping by. Thank you for participating in the chat. Thank you for submitting your live stream questions. So the next session we have, if you're interested in submitting something for the future, then you can submit that to my blog. You can go to 590.red/live, and there you will find instructions on how to, I'll put the new date up once I've set up a new date in maybe the next day. And then you'll see instructions there on how to submit questions or submit images. These could be images that you'd like me to critique, or they could be images you'd like me to edit, or maybe a problem image that you just don't know how to solve a certain problem. I can take a look at it and see if I can help. So go ahead and send me any of those, and I'll probably schedule a couple more sessions, and we'll keep working through everything everybody sent in. So thank you all so much for attending. Have a good day.